Harvard Divinity School.
Uses and abuses of power in alternative spiritualities. Implications for spiritual care of patients and communities. April 28, 2023.
Great. Okay. Thank you for coming and have fun. Beyond its status as a real, lived, and material phenomenon, the intersection of gender transition, religious conversion is also just a really interesting thing to think through. I'm sure many in the audience have in the past heard narratives of both changes, Caitlyn Jenner or St. Paul perhaps, but by and large, such narratives place primacy on one or the other of the two changes. Caitlyn Jenner, gender, specifically the mode of transness, St. Paul, religion, through the mode of a newfound Christianity. But what if gender transition and religious conversion occurred at the same time? For brevity's sake, I refer to this overlap as transition conversion. A brief aside, often when talking to other trans folks who have converted into or out of religions and spiritualities, I hear them make some kind of verbal slippage, like I converted to a trans woman or I transitioned to Judaism. This is a telling slippage, and I mention it at first here because I feel it indicates important and generative kinds of overlap, fluidity, and intertwinedness between the two types of changes. I should briefly mention that when I use the term trans in this presentation, I'm always using it as an umbrella term to refer, for sake of conciseness, to any non-cisgender identity or community I otherwise specify. This presentation follows a line of research I've done on this topic with an eye toward the ways religious conversion studies and trans studies could come into conversation to illuminate the question of transition conversion. That is, how it works, if at all, and what it might look like if so. This paper explores some of the relevant literature of conversion studies, trans studies, and to the limited extent I can within the space of this paper, trans religious studies, in order to elucidate the intersection, or at least the thinking together of the two. Across these fields, I find three main recurring themes. A, the manifestations of these changes as deeply interconnected and evocative assemblages, which I understand here roughly as the ways in which individuals live socially intertwined with others in the world. More on this in a moment. B, the frequently awkward and heterogeneous nature of such changes. And C, the ways the changes reveal both the quote unquote limits of the categories within which such changes occur, as well as the couchings of identity, or in other words, the ways identities are nested within and related to other identities that render such transitions and conversions understandable in the first place. I propose that the first two similarities, assemblages and awkwardness, are co-constitutive of the third element, that of, for lack of a more concise term, the illumination of identity boundaries. But conversely, this third element itself informs and gives weight to the assembled and awkward nature of gender transition, religious conversion, and also their intersection. While these three elements are more or less arbitrary, I didn't only have to choose three and they didn't have to be these three, I nonetheless see the thinking together of gender transition, religious conversion in the form of transition conversion as greatly illuminated by the foregrounding of these parallels. I intend this presentation to be then the posing of a set of hopefully generative questions about transition and conversion, or as before, what I hopefully more concisely term transition conversion with an N-EN rather than a hyphen between the two terms to indicate their intertwinedness, fluidity, and mutual communicability. I hope this thinking together, which to my knowledge and according to my research, has either never or at least rarely been done, might open the way for substantial research on this set of trans religious and spiritual experiences. I see the dynamic of transition conversion not as some obscure intersection or academic niche. This is real, this is lived, and this is, I believe, a crucial thing to understand if trans religiosity and spirituality are to be engaged. It's an underrepresented area of research in the already underrepresented, but I think massively important, discipline of trans religious studies. I also note that this isn't meant to be a positive or prescriptive statement of what I view this intertwinedness or trans religiosity writ large to be. Dutch scholar of religion Marieke van den Berg is, to my knowledge, the only academic who has approached this question with any consistency. Her 2020 paper, Embodying Transformation, explores parallels between gender transition, religious conversion in two Jewish women's memoirs. Through the Door of Life by Joy Ladin, which details the author's experience coming out as a transgender woman, and Uncovered by Leah Lax, which relates the author's conversion into and out of Hasidism, and consequently out of Judaism altogether. Van den Berg concludes, I think rightly, that there's a pressing need for forms of dialogue between both conversion studies and trans studies. but note the terminology. Vandenberg underscores the parallels between transition and conversion. Thank God I was sure I was Jewish, Layton remarks toward the end of her memoir. One of these two identities, religion or gender, always seems stable in Vandenberg's inquiry. I want to know what one could make of their happening at the same time. Similarly, if, as Vandenberg seems to throughout her paper, we take as axiomatic, or at least pretty solid for now, the notion that to transition one's gender, binarily or not, is in a sense automatically to convert within a religion, in that one's embodied lived experience within that tradition is radically and perhaps irrevocably changed, then considering transition conversion together seems like the necessary next step to any discussion of transreligiosity. But still, transness feels like more than this. What if, supposing at the very beginning of this longer inquiry, both changes, gender and religious, were in some sense volitional? Not necessarily volitional in a modern liberal individualistic way, but what if we were to suppose some kind of consistent flux, an ebb and flow of fluid change and insecurity between the two? Certainly, again, the question of liberalism is important here, and to table temporarily the question of agency is not itself an unpolitical move. But for now, and due to the time constraints of this presentation, I hope simply to imagine what these dual movements look like, and importantly, what they could make. In their 2016 paper, Contemporary Religion in the Cisgendering of Reality, sociologist J.E. Sumerow describes the experiences of a variety of trans ex-Mormons facing social isolation in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints following their coming out. Sumerow coins cisgendering as an epistemic process that renders trans experiences as marginal, excessive, and monstrous. While Sumerow's analysis is powerful and incisive, what interests me most in their paper is what they believe to be the prescriptive outcome of their study: the articulation of a positive trans religious experience, that is, one that does not merely find its definition as something conventional religion, whatever that means, is not. This presentation takes Sumerow's call as a kind of jumping off point, though maybe not quite yet a concrete goal, to find, or at least to imagine, what a trans religious experience might look like and what social and political factors are at play that render such experiences intelligible as such. A full survey of modern academic literature on religious conversion is impossible within the bounds of this presentation, but there are certain motions and tendencies broadly construed within the field that are relevant to this project. Broadly, one of the most enlightening trends in the discipline has been, over the past 3 or 4 decades, a movement away from taking as an implicit basis for defining and understanding conversion what is referred to as the Pauline, i.e. St. Paul model. That is, sinful before, redeemed after, cataclysm in between, little ambiguity on either side of the conversion. This is a caricature. This is exemplified in the work of William James and A.D. Nock, both of whom have at this point become the field's Protestant Christian foils. Instead, leading thinkers have challenged this MO and proposed frameworks for understanding conversion that see it as at once more nuanced, less atomistic, and more linear. The general thrust of these thinkers' work, I argue, can be illuminated by attending to the 3 themes identified earlier: assemblages, awkwardness, and the illumination of identity boundaries. In a key early 2000s edited volume on the anthropology of religious conversion, Australian anthropologist Diane Austin Bruce articulates this alternative conception of religious conversion and of studying religious conversion in the first place, when she notes that a broader and more refined view of conversion phenomena would entail an emphasis, quote, not on singular experience, paranormal or otherwise, or in an absolute breach with a former life, but rather on the way in which conversion is a passage, constituted and reconstituted through social practice and the articulation of new forms of relatedness, end quote. Implicated in a more charitable study of conversion, then, is a treatment of these kinds of interconnected and often communal, assembled ways conversion plays out. In another essay on the methodological considerations of conversion studies, Donald Taylor highlights what are to him the 3 kinds of conversion: inward, outward, and awkward. The first 2 terms signify the ways in which religions narrate conversions to and away from their traditions. And the third term, in Taylor's view, indicates the kind of uncomfortable, not easily narratable shifts that characterize conversion in many cases that do not fit the Pauline model, or for that matter, those employed by James or Nock. Taylor describes certain conversions as awkward in that they make, quote, boundary walls between religions more porous than it first seemed, end quote. This is thus representative of the second theme of transition conversion I highlight here, that of the nuanced, complicated, and often messy reality of religious conversions. Another powerful shift in the field of conversion studies the past few decades has been spearheaded by the work of Talal Asad and Gary Vishwanathan, both of whom interrogate the phenomenon of conversion and the question of even asking what conversion is in the first place as a project always tied up with colonial, race, and class investments. In other words, both thinkers view the methodologies and concepts which religious and conversion studies use in their operation as rife with implicit assumptions about their boundaries and political utility. Assad specifically sees religious conversion as intertwined, if not coextensive with, conversions to modernity. The question of why people convert, Assad says, quote, is not entirely innocent. Religious conversion appears to need explaining in a way that secular conversion into modern ways of being does not, end quote. Why specifically this is the case is beyond the scope of this presentation, yet this discrepancy is interesting, and it reveals one of the multitude of ways in which the academic observation of religious phenomena often reveals much about the identities and positionalities in both the observer and the subject themselves. What we've outlined here then are three similarities across conversion studies that both encapsulate recent relevant moves within the field, and which also suggest helpful parallels that let it bridge over to trans studies, and furthermore to the investigation of transition conversion phenomena. I'll now probe the disparate and oftentimes motley field of trans studies, and by extension, trans-religious studies, in a similar way. Much important work on the deeply communal, intertwined, and interconnected nature of transness and trans communities has arisen the past decade or so. Gil Malatino's work in particular is insightful in its characterization of transness as amenable to, or in a certain way constitutive of, deeply communal and mutual ways of knowing and caring. I refer to these groups of relations as assemblages. Their 2020 book, Trans Care, argues in one chapter that part and parcel of being trans is the participation in relation to assemblages. Malatino writes, quote, assemblage thinking comes easily to trans folks. Most of us find Eurocentric myths of maximal agency, atomistic selfhood, and radical self-possession a really hard sell, end quote. Deeply implicated in living transness in the world is fraught and oftentimes intense negotiation with those around you about recognition. Will this individual recognize my pronouns? How am I presenting? Are you trans? Recognition is a gift in Malatino's words, and trans folks often find their own ontological security hinging on this very cis gift. The crux of how I'm reading Malatino then is that to be trans is to be deeply and irrevocably connected to both the cis and other trans folks around you in very sensitive and immediate ways. And relatedly, it almost always just feels bad. In character for us trans folks, there's a large swath of literature on feeling bad as a trans person. Of significance here, Gil and Malatino, again, Cameron Awkward-Rich and Andrea Longtrue and Emmett Harson Drager's essay, After Trans Studies. Along these lines, what I've found to be the general analog to the critiques of Pauline models of conversion in conversion studies is what Siobhan Kelly identifies as messianic language in trans public speech. In their article of the same name, Kelly identifies several notable mainstream examples of trans folks appealing to certain norms of legitimation, like messianic language that communicates a clear and unambiguous undesirable before and redeemed after to achieve public recognition as trans. In that, it opens only a limited set of possibilities for trans routes to public recognition. The employment of this rhetoric, Kelly claims, quote, leads to a narrowing of intelligible embodied possibilities and flattens trans life into a monolith, end quote. Transitions are much messier, much more painful and bad feeling than such messianic language might lead non-trans thinkers to believe. And of course, in a sense evocative of Assad and Vishwanathan, the very notion of gender transitioning and yes, gender as a category itself is bound up with medical, industrial, class, race, and ability presuppositions that, if nothing else, reveal the interplay of identity couchings, or as before, nestings, in the very person attempting to explore transition in the first place. To take but one example, C. Riley Snorton argues poignantly along these lines in his 2017 book, Black on Both Sides, which explores the contours of Black American transness and, more specifically, the ways that the subjugation of Black bodies serve to render common notions of gender as fungible. Along both lines, it is trans studies' wariness of methodologies and presuppositions, as well as a wariness of transgender's familiarity and legibility within academia writ large, that I believe is crucial to bring to this transition conversion project. So then, what happens when a trans person converts to another religious identity? Or what if somebody who's questioning their religious identity, say, starts taking estrogen? I suppose that's what I'm trying to figure out and what this project has aimed to open the door to be able to do. I see this paper as the start of an ongoing series of projects and works that strive to better understand and shed light on these transition conversion phenomena. Recall the three important trends of modern conversion studies I mentioned earlier: assemblages, awkwardness, and identity boundaries. I have shown that in addition to their centrality to modern conversion studies, they also find pretty neat analogs in trans studies. I'd like to propose a third move here, that is, to claim that these parallels also might hold shape within the phenomenon of transition conversion. The rest of this presentation then will be dedicated to outlining three ripe corresponding areas for conversation between religious conversion and trans studies. A, the deep intertwinedness between self, religious, and gender identities in community. B, the deep awkwardness and discomfort of navigating both gender and religious tumult. And C, the kinds of identities and category limits encountered by the simultaneity of transition and conversion. I see these as important parallels, ones that could provide similarities between both fields to potentially format a more positive idea of what a distinctively trans religiosity or religious/spiritual method could look like. The extent to which assemblages come into play in both transition, in conversion and trans studies raises, I think, the interesting suggestion of a reading of transition conversion as itself operating as a kind of assemblage, a gathering of identity investments that negotiate priority and placement from gender to religion, family, community, and self. This kind of instability is, I imagine, productive, then in at least two ways. In the constructed self that inheres throughout and maybe despite this two-way flux, and in a scholarly sense by showing to both the observer and to the subject radically variable local lived truths of transition conversion. In the second realm of similarity, when thinking transition conversion together, the work of Abby Stein is a prime example of the awkwardness, discomfort, and stop-starts of transition conversion. Her 2019 memoir, Becoming Eve, chronicles her upbringing and rearing as a Hasidic rabbi, as well as her subsequent coming out as a transgender woman, culminating in her leaving Hasidic Judaism altogether. While she claims in the book's introduction to be framing her memoir as one of simultaneous transition and conversion, she rarely does so in the book. Her blog, The Second Transition, on the other hand, does offer helpful material on this. Throughout Becoming Eve, and frequently on her blog, Stein outlines her often complicated commitments, both to what she feels is a quote-unquote honest embodiment and practice of her gender identity, and to the rather conservative religious communities that form central parts of her identity throughout her life. In a blog post written in 2018, Stein outlines the conflicts and religious nausea, my term, she felt participating in a program that brought her, along with 150 rabbis, for 10 days of study in Jerusalem. She says, and this is a blog quote, "No, I am not religious, okay, in an Orthodox sense again. Heck, if you ask if I believe in the monotheistic Abrahamic traditional concept of God, I'm a larger atheist than ever before. But I am excited. I am excited because I love our tradition. I'm excited because I see a world where I can cherry pick my spiritual and traditional practices, and that is not just okay, but beautiful. I am excited because I reached a point in my life where I'm comfortable enough in my own skin to look back and embrace what I love about my childhood and yeshiva years and rejoice with it," end quote. To Stein, in a way that stands in contrast both to Pauline conversion narratives and to conventional transition narratives, one is never simply able to abandon the past. We may be through with the past, but the past is not through with us. To carry one's trans body, one's converted body, through the world during, after, or even before transition conversion is necessarily to bear a trace of those alternative selves, those would-be pasts, and it is alongside those memories that we all do and must live our lives. Stein is right. It is beautiful. And so the third similarity, that of identity boundaries. To be somewhat crude, and while a strict analogy is both naive and politically irresponsible, I do think it worthwhile to at least wonder about limits and how much gender transition and religious conversion expose and engage with them in their respective fluidities. To put it more simply, if gender transition or transgender writ large is an analytic category, fundamentally brings into focus the limits or at least problematic nature of hegemonic gender identity, and if religious conversion reveals a substrate of personal, religious, and spiritual positionality, then why shouldn't transition conversion do something similar across both identity categories? Could it perhaps expose, stretch, and question those limits and boundaries in the first place? So then, the third and final element here is the interplay of couched identities, covert investments, crypto privileges, so to speak. What of one's ability renders transition conversion legible or even possible? What remains when both gender and religious identities are in flux, unstable. How might transition conversion track or not track depending on religious and spiritual faith, colonial and racial statuses, and or disability? As we've seen, factors of racialization, legibility, and coloniality are always at play in such discourses. I strongly believe that this third element not only reveals the limits, whatever you want to understand those as, of the identities of gender and religion, but it also exacerbates, brings into the dynamic other already existent or emerging identity formations. Some future time, I hope to be able to answer these valid and pressing inquiries better, and it seems at the moment that this will grow into a much larger project. But for now, I hope this presentation served as a helpful and brief look into a budding new area of research. Thank you.
Sponsored by the Program for the Evolution of Spirituality.
Copyright 2023, President and Fellows of Harvard College.